Welcome back to the deep dive. It's it's amazing to think, how many families are out there still searching for answers,
Hmm.
still wondering what happened to their loved ones. Thousands every year. And today, we're diving into one of those stories that just stuck with us.
Yeah.
The unsolved case of Sylvia Baker,
Yeah.
a young mother found murdered in a Hartford park all the way back in 1982.
Wow.
Over 40 years, her children have lived with this just massive hole in their lives. And you, our listeners, you send us a ton of material on this case, articles, podcasts, even some personal reflections. So let's try to make sense of it all together.
What I find fascinating about this case is that even after all these years, 4 decades, it's still active.
Right.
There's active investigation. DNA evidence has come into play. They're still pursuing leads. I mean, this really speaks to the dedication of those seeking justice, but also the advancements in forensic technology that just weren't available back then.
It really does. So let's rewind. Let's go back to that hot summer day in 1982. Imagine Hartford, Connecticut. The sun is beating down. Sylvia Baker steps out of her apartment just for a moment to take out the trash. Her two young kids are inside,
Right.
probably playing, totally unaware that this is the last time they'll ever see their mother.
And then the next day, she's found in Keeney Park, a place that should be full of families and laughter,
Right.
summertime. But instead, it becomes a scene of this chilling discovery. Sylvia was found nude, blindfolded, and bound. And there's this one detail that really jumped out at me. The different types of knots used on her wrists and ankles.
Hmm.
That's not just random, that suggests multiple perpetrators, maybe even with different levels of experience or familiarity with knots.
That's a great catch. It's so easy to overlook details like that, but they can be so significant. And speaking of details, the police actually found a man's wallet and underwear about 150 feet from Sylvia's body, belonged to a guy named Joe who lived nearby.
Right. And Joe claimed that he had been in the park, saw the commotion around Sylvia's body, and only later realized he was missing his wallet. But here's the thing.
Okay.
His wallet wasn't on a path. It was tucked away in some bushes. Not really a place you'd casually drop something. Plus, there was condensation under it, suggesting it had been there for a while.
Like overnight, maybe?
Yeah, possibly.
That detail from the podcast that you highlighted is fascinating. It almost feels like an old detective show, doesn't it? Someone trying to be clever, but overlooking this tiny but crucial detail.
Exactly. So, while Joe's story definitely had some holes, the police had to keep all avenues open, right?
Right.
They interviewed Sylvia's mother, Ethel, who was understandably devastated, and they even talked to her 8-year-old son, Kelsey.
Oh, gosh. Can you imagine having to ask a child that young about the last time he saw his mother?
It's heartbreaking. But Kelsey actually provided a key detail. He saw his mother talking to neighbors before she disappeared. And these neighbors, they recalled seeing her get into a dark-colored van with several people inside. It seemed she went willingly, which adds another layer of complexity to this whole case.
It does. So the van becomes this recurring element in the investigation, but sadly, a lot of the initial leads, they just run cold. Sylvia's ex-boyfriend Lester was looked into. Even a theory about a potential cult connection, which Ethel kind of put forth because of Sylvia's interest in Rastafarianism.
Oh, wow.
But nothing concrete emerged.
Yeah.
It's just incredibly frustrating, right?
Wow.
A young mother is gone. Her children are left wondering what happened. And the case seems to just stall. It's easy to see how in those early days, without the technology we have now, investigators might hit these dead ends.
Absolutely. But then a disturbing pattern starts to emerge in Hartford over the next decade. Several other young women are found murdered, many with similarities to Sylvia's case, the brutality, the locations. It raises this chilling possibility. Could a serial killer, or maybe even a group of them, be operating in the city?
That's what the police started to consider. Many of the victims, they frequented the same clubs in Hartford, and the brutality was horrifyingly similar.
Right.
But there's a crucial difference with Sylvia. She wasn't involved in sex work like some of the other victims. She was a dedicated mother, a student, just working hard to make ends meet. So does that mean we're looking at multiple perpetrators, operating with similar methods but different motives?
It's certainly a question that needs to be explored. Were some specifically targeting vulnerable groups like sex workers, while others, like whoever murdered Sylvia, had something else in mind? This is where understanding Hartford in the 80s becomes crucial. What were the social attitudes back then? How did law enforcement approach these cases? Were certain groups more vulnerable, due to societal biases or lack of protection?
That's a great point. We can't just look at these cases in isolation. We have to consider the context. And while Sylvia's case remained cold, the investigation into these other murders eventually led to the formation of the Connecticut Cold Case Task Force in 1992.
Right.
This dedicated team, they were formed to revisit these unsolved cases, bringing fresh eyes and new techniques to the table.
But even with this renewed focus, Sylvia's case would languish for many more years. Just think about her children, Kelsey and Elena, growing up not knowing who took their mother, always wondering, always hurting.
It's a burden no one should have to carry. But before we get into how this case takes a dramatic turn, let's just pause here for a moment. Let that sink in. A young life cut short, a family shattered, and a city grappling with the fear that a killer or killers may still be out there.
We left off with Sylvia's case kind of stuck in limbo, right? Overshadowed by this whole potential serial killer situation in Hartford. But even as those investigations were going on, Sylvia's case wasn't forgotten.
And in 2019, a retired detective, Steve Kumnick, takes another look at Sylvia's file. This is decades after the initial investigation. And Kumnick suggests something that wasn't even an option back in '82, using modern DNA technology.
Yeah, it's incredible how far forensic science has come. They were able to find a preserved sample from the original investigation, a single sperm cell. One tiny cell overlooked for years held the potential key to unlock this whole mystery.
It really shows how even the smallest pieces of evidence can be crucial, and how important it is to never give up on these cold cases. And in November 2019, they got a hit. The DNA matched a man named Grant, someone the Hartford police were very familiar with.
And here's where things get really, really interesting, maybe even a bit unsettling. Grant had a long and disturbing history of violence against women, and his crimes often involve elements that were eerily similar to what happened to Sylvia.
So Grant had a pattern of impersonating a police officer to lure women into his car. Then he would rob and sexually assault them, often taking them to Keeney Park.
The same park where Sylvia's body was found.
Chilling.
It's hard to ignore those parallels, right? Grant's past crimes, his connection to Keeney Park, and now this DNA match, it all paints a very compelling picture. Could this finally be the break they'd been waiting for after all these years?
It seemed like it. But, with this case, just when you think you're getting close to an answer, another twist emerges. While going through Sylvia's belongings, Detective Jacobson, who is now leading the investigation, stumbles upon a connection between Sylvia and our very first suspect, Joe, the man whose wallet was found near her body.
Remember Joe, the guy who claimed he just happened to be in the park that day? Well, Detective Jacobson found Joe's brother, Milo, listed in Sylvia's contact book.
Wait a minute, so we have a potential DNA match to a man with a history of violence against women, and now a direct link between Sylvia and the brother of that very first suspect.
It gets even more complicated. Milo had recently been imprisoned for crimes that were very similar to those committed by Grant, kidnapping and raping women while blindfolding and binding them. And to add yet another layer to all of this, Joe and Milo have another brother, Walter, who drove a dark blue van in the 80s.
Okay, now my head is spinning. Are you saying the van Sylvia was last seen getting into could have belonged to the brother of a man whose wallet was found near her body? A and D, both of those brothers have a history of violent crimes against women that mirror Grant's MO. This is almost too much to process.
It's a lot to unpack. Instead of one potential suspect, now we have this whole web of individuals, potentially a family, with this deeply disturbing pattern of behavior. The scope of the investigation just explodes outward.
It begs a question. Was Sylvia specifically targeted by this group, or was she just a tragic caught in a much larger, more sinister web of predation? And if so, what was it about Sylvia that brought her into their orbit?
Those are the questions Detective Jacobson has been wrestling with ever since. He's been going over every detail, trying to understand if there were any prior connections between Sylvia and any of these men, what their motive might have been.
He's even gone back to those clubs in North Hartford, hoping to find someone who remembers Sylvia from back then, anyone who might have seen something, anything, that could shed some light on what happened.
It's a long shot, but you never know what small detail might trigger a memory, might provide that missing link. And as of today, this investigation is still very much active. The detectives are determined to untangle this complicated web of connections and piece together the events that led to Sylvia's death.
It's been over 40 years, but the possibility of finally getting answers offers a glimmer of hope. Not just for Sylvia's family, but for the families of all those other women who were murdered during that dark period in Hartford. And it shows that even after decades of silence, the pursuit of justice never truly ends. We've really gone deep on Sylvia Baker's case today, haven't we? What started out as What seemed like a pretty straightforward cold case has turned into this really complex story with multiple potential suspects, a possible family connection to the crimes, and even the idea that Sylvia's murder could be tied to other unsolved cases in Hartford.
Yeah, it's really striking to me how Sylvia's case went from being seen as kind of this outlier to now being right at the center of this very complicated web of events. It makes you wonder, could solving her murder also unlock the answers in those other cases? Could it bring closure to multiple families?
That is a thought-provoking idea for sure. But even with all the progress that's been made, there are still so many questions that remain.
Hmm.
Like, we still don't know for certain who was in that van with Sylvia on the night she disappeared. Was it Grant?
Right.
The DNA match? Was it one or both of Joe's brothers?
Right.
Or were there even more people involved?
And the motive, it's still a mystery. If Sylvia wasn't involved in sex work like some of the other victims, why her? Why was she targeted? Was it a case of mistaken identity, just some horrific random act of violence? Or was there something else entirely connecting her to these men, something we haven't even considered yet?
Those are the questions that have been haunting Sylvia's family, especially her children, Kelsey and Elena, for more than 40 years.
Yeah.
They deserve answers. And so do the families of all the other women whose lives were so tragically cut short.
Their pain and their search for the truth can't be ignored. And like we talked about earlier, the ripple effect of these crimes, it goes way beyond the immediate victims. Unsolved cases, they leave a scar on entire communities. They create a feeling of unease, of unanswered questions, and that can linger for generations.
It really is like a wound that never fully heals.
Yeah.
It leaves everyone feeling vulnerable, wondering if it could happen again. But even amidst all of this darkness, there's still a glimmer of hope. The fact that detectives are still actively pursuing new leads, they're re-interviewing suspects, they're using all the latest forensic techniques to re-examine old evidence, that speaks volumes about their commitment to finding the truth.
It's a powerful message, I think, to anyone who has committed these kinds of crimes. You might think you've gotten away with it for now. But justice has a very long memory. Advances in DNA technology, the dedication of law enforcement, the incredible courage of the victims' families, it all means that even cases that are decades old, they can be solved.
Sylvia Baker's story and the stories of all those other women, they deserve to be heard, and those responsible for their deaths, they deserve to be held accountable. It's really a testament to the power of hope and the relentless pursuit of justice.
This deep dive has taken us through a very dark chapter in Hartford's history, but it's also been a reminder that even in the face of just unimaginable tragedy, the search for truth, it goes on, and you, our listeners, you can be a part of that search.
That's right. If you have any information, even if you think it's too small or insignificant, please contact the Connecticut Cold Case Unit. You really never know your tip. It might be the missing piece that helps crack this case wide open. It could be what brings peace to those who've been waiting so long for answers.
Sometimes it's the tiniest detail that makes all the difference. And to all the families out there still waiting for answers, please know that you are not forgotten. The fight for justice continues.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the unsolved case of Sylvia Baker. We'll be back soon with another case, another story, another search for the truth. Until then, stay curious and keep those questions coming.